Hundreds of Crusaders starved to death. The Crusaders resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead so that they could remain alive. One chronicler described the piles of heads and hands and feet in the houses and in the streets, and others talked in apocalyptic biblical terms of wading through the streets of Jerusalem in blood. In the year 1095, Christianity was the dominant religious force in Europe. Islam was a rising power in the East. I've come to the Temple Church in London, the base in England of the Templar Knights, who would become so closely associated with the crusading movements over the centuries that followed. A period then seen through a prism of religious duty and glory, but now seen much more clearly as a series of dark moments that have left deep and long-lasting scars on the regions it affected. The Crusaders took the decision to march out against the Muslim army that numbered probably double the amount that they had. Somehow, against all of the odds, they managed to win. The Muslim forces' discipline broke and they fled. It's worth giving a little bit of thought here to the prevailing military tactics of the day. Western Christian military thinking relied heavily on a book called De Re Militari, written by Vegetius. It taught that battles were to be avoided as an absolute last resort. They were far too unpredictable and there was no way to guarantee victory. The preferred method of pursuing war was the siege. The purpose of a siege was to seal off a town or a city or a fortress and trap those within and force them to run down their supplies by making sure that no food, no water and no reinforcements could get into it. And then you just wait. How long the siege might last would depend on how well stocked the town was to begin with, how well you choked off their supplies, and on the strength of the resolve of those within. The first action came at the siege of Nicaea. All of these cities were important for the Crusaders to take because of their strategic location, but that location had been chosen to make them nice and easy to defend as well. Nicaea was in a lake, and that made it very difficult for the Crusaders to cut off its supply lines and almost impossible to effectively lay siege to. The town remained strong until Emperor Alexius sent a fleet of ships across land, rolled on logs from the sea to float them into the lake. The sight of these caused those within the city to panic and surrender. From here, the Crusader army split a little. Baldwin of Boulogne made his way to Edessa. He very quickly took the city and the surrounding area, and Emperor Alexios allowed him to keep it and to rule it as a county, giving Baldwin the patrimony in the Holy Land that he had craved. The rest of the army carried on south to Antioch. This was a vast city halfway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. It was so large that there weren't enough Crusaders to surround it and effectively besiege the city, which meant that it remained well supplied and defiant. They camped outside for 8 months, during which hundreds of Crusaders starved to death or began to desert. Eventually, Bohemond found somebody inside the city who was willing to betray it to the Crusaders. He managed to get inside, and the Christians within welcomed them. All of the Muslims inside the city's walls were slaughtered. Soon after that, though, the besiegers would become the besieged. The victorious Crusaders were trapped inside Antioch by a relieving army that had arrived too late to save the city. But now they were stuck inside walls that had no more food and no more water to sustain them. After just 4 days, the Crusaders took the decision to march out against the Muslim army that numbered probably double the amount that they had. Somehow, against all of the odds, they managed to win. The Muslim forces' discipline broke and they fled. Bohemond wanted to keep Antioch for himself. Raymond was having none of it. They promised to give it back to Emperor Alexius if they managed to win it. Bohemond argued that the Emperor hadn't turned up to help them as he'd promised, and therefore their vows to him were null and void. It was true that Alexios hadn't turned up, but the reason for that was that amongst those who had abandoned the siege of Antioch was Stephen of Blois, and he'd made his way back to Emperor Alexios and told him that everything was going horribly wrong and that had caused Alexios to turn back. The Crusaders wasted time lingering in Antioch. There was an outbreak of the plague caused by their failure to move and the cramped, unhealthy conditions. Adhemar of the Puy, the spiritual leader of the crusade, died as a result of that plague, and he was buried in a hole in which they'd found the Holy Lance, a relic, supposedly the weapon that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, which they'd discovered in Antioch. The Crusaders continued south towards Jerusalem. Along the way, they laid siege to various towns, some with success and some they were forced to leave uncaptured. During the siege of Marat, there were reports that due to the desperate lack of food, the Crusaders resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead so that they could remain alive. One Islamic commentator, talking about the defeats suffered to the Christians, called them a shameful calamity to the cause of Islam. When the Crusaders reached Tripoli, which Raymond IV had hoped to set up as a principality for himself to rival Antioch, he found the Muslim emir there tripping over himself to provide them with horses and food and supplies. He even offered to convert to Christianity if they would drive out the Fatimids. All of a sudden, the Muslims were more keen to trade with the Christians than they were to fight with them. On June the 6th, 1099, Bethlehem was captured, and on the following day, the Crusaders arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem. Many of them seemed to weep at the sight of the city that they travelled for almost 3 years and thousands of miles to reach. The Crusaders now lacked the resources to effectively lay siege to Jerusalem. Food was scarce. There was no water within miles of Jerusalem. The defenders of the city had made sure of that. On top of this, there were only about 12,000 of the 50 to 60,000 Crusaders who had crossed the Bosphorus left, and amongst them, tensions were running high amidst the stress of illness and shortage and squabbling over what might be the proceeds of the crusade to come. They were left with only one utterly unappealing prospect, and that was to take the city by direct assault. In June, they made a first attempt. They made it over the outside walls, but were repelled by the inner defences of the city and forced to retreat. The Crusaders began to build siege engines using timber supplied by English and Genoese ships. The Italian merchant states like Genoa and Venice would grow incredibly rich, securing trade monopolies in return for help like this. A priest had a vision which assured the Crusaders that if they would fast for 3 days and then process around the city barefoot, it was guaranteed to fall to them. They gladly performed this homage to the Battle of Jericho and then launched an attack on the city. They attacked on the 13th of July, and it took until the 15th of July to penetrate the northern defences. But as soon as they did, there was a panicked response throughout the city, and Jerusalem fell. What followed was an unforgivable slaughter, faith being used to justify the most extreme and cruel violence. Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the streets of Jerusalem. One chronicler described the piles of heads and hands and feet in the houses and in the streets, and others talked in apocalyptic, biblical terms of wading through the streets of Jerusalem in blood. Almost 3 years after leaving home, and almost 4 after the crusade had first been preached, Jerusalem had been taken. Their planning had been long and detailed, though much of it had fallen apart on contact with the harsh realities of the Holy Land. Fierce determination, a divided enemy, and it must have seemed to them the favour of God had led them to success.